Welcome, Lydia, to our podcast. It's so beautiful to connect with you today.
Thanks, Claire. Oh, it's so good to be here and to connect.
Yay. I'm so excited for our conversation and everything that we're going to cover today. We've got, I think, so much in common and so much that we could talk about, probably a lot more than one episode, but we'll see what we can squeeze into this episode for today. To get us started, I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey of becoming a mother, of discovering your purpose. Where would you like to start with that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I think in this generation, for myself, I'm in my late 40s now. So my whole upbringing was you find a job and that's your life, and you stick to that job. What do you want to be when you grow up, And I could never sit with it. I'm like, I don't know. I just had no idea really. And so I went towards, I quite enjoyed acting and, that sort of thing was sort of the most alive for me. So I worked in the film industry for many years, actually. And that was most of my career was actually working in the film industry. And something about that I liked, I think the freedom that it entailed. But when I had such a strong calling to have children, it's such a non-family friendly environment. You're working sort of 14, 15-hour days a lot of the time. So that really pushed me into getting out of that. And I started nannying because I had such a strong desire to have children, actually. And that really feels, reflecting back now, I see that was a major purpose for me, to have children. And I knew that the real career stuff would come after that, because I didn't really consider the acting for a while. I guess I thought it was, well, I guess that's what I meant to do because it's what I'm drawn to. But I didn't really like pretending to be someone else. I think it was sort of like, I just felt like I needed that sort of, I don't know, that sort of platform, but just being myself, So yeah, it was really a strong pull to have children, actually. And so I worked as a nanny for a few years, and that was a great training ground. I worked while my husband was studying. I did like 50-hour weeks for a woman who had a really busy job, and part of it, she really needed to keep it going. It was a very sort of with a huge company, and she had a really senior role in New Zealand, and her husband had actually had a brain tumor a few years just before they'd had children. So she sort of probably had that in the back of her mind. She really needed to keep up her career in case something happened to him. And he did wind up dying years later. But, so it was that call for her to keep at it was definitely aligned. But it must have been so difficult for her. She had two beautiful little children, one was about 3 and one was 1 when I started. And they were like they're still really close to me, and they're like sort of like my practice children in a way. Something I had this sort of 1-year-old baby to look after and a 3-year-old. And yeah, we were very close. And it was really like being a mother in a way, sort of, except then I could go home and go to bed and support mother
and get a full night's sleep.
Yeah.
Wow, yes.
Mother would then have to be on for her children and also deal with the sometimes, not wanting mum to go and stuff,
Yes.
Yeah. But that was so helpful. And then I left really when I got pregnant and I had my own daughter. And then once I still did a little bit for them with my toddler, as it were, because so that really worked out super well. But then after, it was probably when I had my second child, which was a son 2.5 years later, that I really, once he got settled and things, of course, because he was quite colicky, I really felt, okay, this is the next, I've done that now. It's very interesting how I just had this real pull that they needed to come through and to have these children. And then once that was done, of course, I was still an active mother, but it was really like, okay, what am I here to do? And by then, of course, YouTube had been created, you know, all these different platforms existed. And it really was an understanding now, looking back, that was really what I was wanting to do, is having that platform, but sort of to be myself, and I guess to share what was important to me, which was kind of the pull to be an actor, I think, to have this platform and be a successful actor and to be able to say what's important to you and to have people listen. Whereas now you don't really need that, you know, you can have your own platform, but see, that didn't exist. So I couldn't have known what my true purpose was back then, because it didn't even exist, you know, all the social media and the platforms, like having our own podcast. So I started my own podcast earlier this year, and that's just a true joy, because it's really about just having this platform where people who are interested can listen and tune in, and just to share what's on my heart, because it's really, for me, about just helping, empowering people, especially women who have really been kept down for so long. You know, as girls, we're just sort of kept small in so many ways, as I was as well. So now it's really about just sharing my truth and, you know, encouraging others to shine their beautiful lights, which we're all here to do, you know. So
I love that so
very
much.
long-winded sort of answer, but
Yeah.
it's just very interesting when you connect the dots back, how it's all meant to be, but it's difficult at the time, you know. You're like, what am I here to do?
That's it. You don't know. And the fact that, like, in high school, we're asked to choose at like the age of sort of 15 what subjects we want to take then. And if kids know what they are interested in, it's okay. But for so many kids, they will sort of just pick anything and just have no idea. And even when you leave school and want, go to university, like I had zero idea, and I just kind of randomly picked one, and that worked out okay. But we don't know necessarily, and it's so much easier to look back in hindsight,
Yes,
and go, oh yes. And I mean, often the decisions we make are not actually that far off the path that we end up being aligned to and really passionate in later on in life. There are all breadcrumbs and all learnings, I think, that we put into where we end up channeling our focus and our efforts later in life. But I love that you shared as well that with your upbringing, you just knew that you wanted to have children, but that wasn't necessarily the messaging that you were getting. And it was like, okay, get a job, go get into a field. And for a lot of people, they're brought up, sometimes it's really important for parents that their children are in particular fields. And, maybe they come from a family of accountants or family of doctors, especially when they're these like really high achieving professions. And the kids are sort of told, you will grow up and you will be a doctor, or you'll grow up and you'll be this. And so often they'll follow those steps because that's what their parents sort of tell them is true, but they're not listening to their own voice. And I love that you really followed that inner calling to have kids and have that experience with nannying prior to having kids, so that you started that training. And oh my gosh, what a great way to train yourself for parenting. Really get in the
well, it meant, because I was quite sort of in a way nervous. There's a lot of responsibility on you when you're looking after other people's kids as well. And this family had their own they taught me a lot, because really they were so about respecting the essence of a child, which is what I'm all about as well. But they sort of helped train me in a lot of ways, because they had some certain philosophies. What's it called? I can't even remember what they're called now. I think it's called one of the names for it is the Gerber. So it's about just building that attachment and really seeing, the soul, the soul of the child, I suppose. But it taught me a heck of a lot. But at the same time, there was a lot of thinking about it. You had to, about the way you're sort of commentating how a child is. oh, so you're picking that up, so you're looking at that, it's very heady. It was quite heady for me, and really just wanting to do the best for these parents, for their beautiful children. It was I felt quite a lot of pressure, not so much put on by them, but for myself. So when I had my own children, I was really relaxed, so I was quite
Nice.
a relaxed mother, because it's like, oh, these are mine. I get to choose what, how they're raised,
That's
rather
great.
than trying to do it through someone else. But I mean, I say that I had that purpose of having children. That's looking back now, but I mean, that probably wasn't till I was like 28 or something, because I didn't have children. I had my daughter at 35. So it's really those years of probably, it was 7 years. And it was a process, because I was with a partner at the time when I really started getting clucky, who was actually older than me, and he had older children going into their teens, and he didn't really want any more. He'd had a vasectomy. So I knew the universe was telling me that this relationship was for a reason or a season, but not a lifetime. So I
love that saying, reason, season, or lifetime. It's just such a great way to look at some relationships.
It really is. And it was hard as anything to break up. I mean, we did wind up breaking up, because I knew that I would have just gone resentful if I had have just, he was sort of like, oh, maybe when we're rich and famous and we can afford a nanny, maybe we'll have children then. It's like, no, this isn't going to happen. I don't want it that way. And I don't want it just as a tack on. This is important to me. So we did wind up breaking up, and it was horrible, because there was a lot of love there, but you just have to follow your heart. And it kind of was.
Not a lot of people do that, though. That's beautiful that you did, because there's a lot of people out there that will sacrifice their own needs and their own inner calling for the needs of others, or because, well, it's too hard to break up because we love each other, and we can override those inner nudges and that inner calling with our logic and our reasoning, and we can make it make sense. But that call tends to get stronger and stronger, doesn't it, until we just act on it, or our life turns to chaos because we're not listening to it.
It's easier. I mean, and that's right. You sort of think, well, it's easier just to go with the status quo, keep with what I'm doing, but actually it's not easier in the big picture. I've always sort of had that feeling. It's actually not easier to drown out that call in the end, because it's like getting, how sometimes some relationships, like, they break up and get back together and break up and get back together. And for me, it's always been like, well, that's just a step backwards. It's just, you just need to move onward. There's obviously a reason there, and just move onwards, so it's always, sometimes taking the hard steps is easier in the long run. And I've always sort of tuned into that,
Yes. Yeah, I think I have in many ways as well. Like, it's sort of my past relationships have always got to this point where it's like, our time is done. And it's not easy, but when we have that sort of inner call that's pulling us in a direction, it's so important to listen to that. So I'm curious, given this calling was quite strong for you, and you made some hard decisions to be able to follow it, what was it like? So you knew you wanted to become a mother, and you had this pre-experience of looking after kids, and you were really in the weeds of looking after the kids, which is amazing. A lot of new mums don't have that. Sometimes we can have this fairy tale expectation of what it's like, or how we want to mother and how we want to parent. And then the actual reality of it can end up being quite different. Like for example, for us, before we had our first baby, we were like, we're not going to be parents that use dummies. We're, the pacifiers. We're against that. And then after hours and hours of our baby colicking, we're like, haven't we got a dummy somewhere? And we went and found it and put it in her mouth, and straight away she stopped crying. And we're like, we're parents that love dummies. Well, for our American audience, dummies is pacifiers. I think that's terminology that's used there. So do you remember any kind of things like that, where you thought you had these ideas of how either you were going to be or how you were going to parent, these ideologies, and then through the experience of actually doing it, And with your specific children's needs, it was completely different.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just making it easy on yourself. And I'm quite eco, and that's quite an important thing to me. But yeah, I wound up using disposable nappies because it was, I sort of did a bit of both. But I mean, because I remember thinking, oh, it takes how long? 500 years or something. And it's just horrifying.
It's crazy.
It's something horrifying, you know, how long it takes to break down. But sometimes you just have to do what it takes to cope, you know. And I did do a mix, but you know, I'd always thought, no, yes, I'll use this, use reusable nappies all the time. And that just didn't happen because it's just too hard. And sometimes you just need to make it easier on yourself. But the interesting thing for me was when I first got pregnant, I wound up having a miscarriage, which was heartbreaking. And once you have one, you realize how common it is, but also how much it affects you, because you hear the idea, you hear the term thrown around, and you just think, oh yeah, but until you actually have one, especially when you've been longing to get pregnant and oh, we've finally conceived, and then that happens. And for us, I didn't really naturally miscarry. I just went for a scan at 13 weeks, the routine scan, and then they found that there was no heartbeat, and that's sort of set off a bit of a PTSD in me. I can remember the moment, both me and my husband remember that moment in the ultrasound office where even the fact that the technician said, oh, Linda, and I'm like, it's not Linda, it's Lydia, because so people always mix up my name. It's just little things like that. It was like this sort of blow by blow account in my head, and that's often a sign of PTSD, I think. But yeah, there was deep grief with that. And then when I did get pregnant with my daughter, probably about a year later, the conceptions were like about a year apart, and I got quite real anxiety. Actually, I got quite OCD and worried that, oh, if I do this or that, it'll happen again. So I had it was beautiful in some ways, and then it was quite a fraught pregnancy in other ways, you know. You know, you'd go to a Thai restaurant and then something to have dinner, and then something would trigger the back of my mind, like, oh, doesn't lemongrass cause miscarriages? And you go home and I'd Google, does lemongrass cause miscarriages? Oh, it does. And I'd get sort of hysterical, and oh my God, it was just something else. So then I think once I had my baby, it was almost a relief, you know. It was like, oh, she's here, and I was just happy, you know, because she was there and in my arms, and I could be, you know, like I say, it was just, I could relax actually. So it's quite a different experience to how a lot of people will have that honeymoon phase of, oh, I'm pregnant, and have the baby, then it's like wake up to reality. It was sort of the opposite way around for me. But yeah, and then of course, when I got pregnant with my son a couple of years later, I wasn't worried, you know, that whole worry and anxiety is gone, because you're just busy coping with your toddler. And
that's true. You're very distracted.
Very distracted. And I think you're confident that, you know, okay, my body can do this, it'll be fine, you know. So
it sounds like that the second pregnancy was a really beautiful healing journey for you to go through, and then finally be able to hold your daughter in your arms and see her healthy and happy, and, you know, like go through that process and know that you could carry to full term. And it's really beautiful to hear that was such a healing process for you. And then you were just able to let go of that anxiety and enjoy the parenting journey, which that's really speaks volumes that you were able to let that anxiety go when you'd reached that point, and not, you know, there's so much anxiety for a lot of new parents in those early stages. And
it's huge.
Yeah, so it's nice that you could relax into it. I mean, I'm sure there were still times when you're like, what is this?
I had a lot of support. I think we were living
amazing.
at the time in Auckland, we were living in a sort of self-contained apartment, but right by my parents' house, like sort of at the bottom of my parents' house, which was amazing because, you know, if I'd be a little bit worried about something, oh, what's the baby doing? I'll just sort of
go inside to my parents' place and sort of get my mum to eyeball her or whatever, you know, just having that extra set of eyes. And of course he had my husband, but he would sometimes, he sort of surprised me once we had children and stuff, that he'd sort of freak out a little bit, like, oh gosh, you know, I'm like, yeah, I was sort of more the calm one with a few of those things, and it sort of surprised me. So sometimes it was good just to have my mum, who'd already had 2 kids, and you know, she could just eyeball her and say, oh no, I think it's right.
Yeah, having that other perspective. That's nice that you were able to call on your mum, because I think that's something that is often missing for parents, not having that support system and not being able to have that wisdom and support passed on through the generations. You know, we're so isolated now, even though it's weird because we're more connected than we've ever been before with social media and online and Zoom and that, but then in the same breath, we're also more disconnected because we don't have those in-person contact and people living close to us that have that wisdom often to pass on. So
and it's hard for the older generation as well, I think, suddenly being closeted away. And it was a beautiful scenario. Me and my husband, well, it was just my boyfriend then, we're in another city and we're moving back to Auckland, which is my hometown and where my parents live. And they sort of said, oh, do you want to live in the, you know, it's my mum's studio, she's an artist, but she wasn't using it. And they made it into an apartment. And then I was like, oh yeah, why not? So it was just me and my husband. And then we had 1 baby, we had 2 babies, and we stayed there till my oldest was about 7 actually. And it was beautiful for the kids, just having so many people around who loved them and keep an eye on them. And it was really nice for me and my husband just to have that space, and we could go out and
oh my gosh, amazing, completely. And I do wonder if maybe we're coming back to that a little bit, like you know, at least in New Zealand with the cost of living, it's almost it's so hard for young families now to you know, afford housing, and then that forces mothers to go straight back to work. And it's almost, how nice would it be if we could be more in that old village sort of style where the elders passed on that wisdom and you know, cared for the babies while the parents had some time or, you know, space. And which I know that, you know, in some cultures they still do it, which I think is so beautiful, and it's such an amazing support for mums.
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, and also there's crucial housing shortages, I know, in New Zealand and Australia, where I've just moved to, and we've actually gone back to a similar thing because my aunt and uncle are here, and we've moved to a place which is a huge housing shortage, and they said, just come here. They've got an enormous house, and so essentially we're kind of doing the same actually until we find a place. But it's so lovely, and it's always a win-win, you know. Helps them with their mortgage, and it's quite inexpensive for us, and it's an amazing place, you know.
That's beautiful because and then opening up to accept that support really allows you to land on your feet, as it did when you had your baby. You were able to, well, when you have a baby, it's not landing on your feet, it's spending time getting off your feet, spending time in bed, but or on the couch feeding and things. But you know, then receiving that support as well, and living in that way. It's for now, when you've made this other transition in your life, you know, I think we've got so used to that like martyr mindset of, I don't need help, I can do it all by myself. But it really does not support us. It doesn't support our family unit. It doesn't teach our children positive, healthy ways and mindsets for living. We're social beings. We're like herd animals. We need to have people around us in that support system, especially if we've got others that we're looking after.
Oh, and it's so interesting. That's exactly right. This is another big transition. And we've been so fortunate that we have had, you know, such great support from, you know, family members. We've got a really supportive family. And my aunt and uncle, they're only about 12 years older than me. So it's more sort of like an older sister. It's sort of just in the middle, you know, because it's my mother's half sister from a second marriage. So yeah, it's beautiful. So they're quite on our wavelength, and they've just been so helpful with so much, because it really does. I've noticed when you move to a new place, your bandwidth is quite small. You're just sort of familiarizing yourself, then gradually your circle gets wider and wider. I'm just noticing now after 2 months, we're starting to branch out and be able to take more in, because it is quite a thing.
It's a huge thing. Yes, I've moved different cities twice. I lived in London when I was younger, and then moved over to Melbourne as well when before my husband and I had kids. And it's huge that the shift, and I like the way you say that it's sort of, and then you can start to sort of reach out a little bit more and spread your wings and start to meet people. But at the start, it's similar to having a baby. It's like that kind of the micro things of what do we need to do right now to set ourselves up, like schools for the kids, bank account numbers, just even remembering your phone number and your street. Well, you don't need to remember phone numbers these days, but where you live, you know.
I know. And I still, people say, oh, what's your phone number? I'll go, hang on a second, I'll look at in my contacts. Lydia, Australian phone number. I mean, it's just all those things. It's a lot. And I know
you don't realize until we do it.
You really don't. And it's really nice having, support, and also having our husband, doing it with someone else is nice, because we've really been able to share the bandwidth, because he's just found a job now. But, at the beginning we just said, well, let's just focus on getting ourselves orientated and settled, so he can drop the kids off to school. Even getting a car, I mean, that's another thing. You really need a car. So then it's like, I have to find a car. And it's a lot. And that was without even having to find a place to rent. We had an address. We got picked up at the airport by my uncle, and we just came here, and there was rooms already set up for all of us and beds made. So I mean, we had it so easy. I mean, imagine having to go to an Airbnb for a few nights and be just looking for a place. It's very difficult.
Oh my gosh.
Accept the help if it's there.
Accept the help. I love that. So I was just going to ask you that if you've got a tip that you would love to share with the audience before we wrap up. So accept the help is a beautiful tip. Do you want to expand on that, or is there something else that's really on your heart that you'd love to share with people who might have resonated with any part of your story today?
Well, it's I mean, I was just talking with the group who I'm part of yesterday, and I was, it's so often we really do push away the help, or just say, oh, apologize for taking up that space, because I had something I was talking about, an issue, and then they're all chiming in and helping me, and I'm like, sorry guys, it's taking up so much of the time, we've only gone out together. And they're like, stop, don't apologize, because we're so eager to nurture others, but then when it comes time to be nurtured, we're not willing to take that time and that space, and they said, don't apologize. Gosh, you'd be quite happy if it was someone else, who you were helping. So it's really about just taking that time and taking that space and energy that people give you. And that's been a big lesson for me. And I see that it is a win-win. I see my aunt and uncle are happy to have us here, and it's helping, and it's benefiting them in a lot of ways as well. It's hugely benefiting us. But it's just about taking that time and what you need, because also with having a coaching business, I see sometimes when people have to reschedule, something's happened, I see that it's a win-win. It's uncanny that it happens right when I have something clashing, or, so it's like, that's totally fine. It actually works for me as well. It's so often if we just do things which are aligned, it's always a win-win. So take the help, take the space which you need. That's a real big one for women, I think, because as girls, we're so taught to not take up space and to play small. And now is the time. We are rising, and it really is time to shine our lights. And by doing that, it's helping others, helping the next generation, but even women our age, or older or whatever, just to have that permission to do the same. So it's so important to me. It's only taken me, half a century, almost half a century to learn, but
God,
scary
but
to
how
say
nice
that.
is it though when we have that awareness ourselves, and we've still got young children, that we can then pass that awareness on to our children, and hopefully in time for them not to be, we're not passing on that generational wound of women should be small and unseen and unheard. Like that is powerful. So it's perfect timing that, you know, it's not too late that you've come across this, because you're stopping the passing on of that to the next generation. So that was so beautifully said. Thank you, Lydia. So where can people find you online?
Well, I'm on Instagram, Lydia Gillman.love2a.t on Instagram, and I've got my websites coming. It's Lydia-Gillman.com. So yeah, that'll be up in the next week or so. So yeah, you can find me there. And yeah, thank you so much for this. It's been so beautiful to connect.